Hello and welcome back for your first lecture and the only lecture of this week. And because you showed up today on a week when you had your second test, you deserve a special kind of praise. So good for you for showing up for this lecture, which, in my humble opinion, is a very important history lesson. And we are going to kind of very broadly cover three different topics today, but I want you to think of all three of them as being intrinsically connected. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about modern science, how the discoveries of modern science inspired the ideas of social Darwinism. We will learn what this means. And then how social Darwinism inspired European countries to engage in conquest of Africa and Asia. And I'm not talking about parts of Africa and Asia, I'm talking about Africa and Asia as continents. But before we move on, let's remind ourselves what we studied last week briefly. Why not? We've said during our last lecture that some of the reasons why the working class revolution never happened was because the real wages of workers were rising. We've said that life and living improvements of the workers were starting to increase. We've studied how, for instance, public transportation has improved, the introduction of electricity made that possible, how certain cities in Europe, predominantly Manchester, Liverpool, London, and Paris, will be the first ones to introduce the sewer systems for the society. And at the same time that the sanitation was improving in the cities, very much related to this momentum of what we titled the Second Industrial Revolution, was also another driving spirit of change that was introduced in the field of science in the late 19th century Europe as well. And so this is how we come to the topic of the modern science, right? And part of this driving force behind the modern science will, of course, be the influences of the earlier scientific revolution, with which we are very familiar with. So kind of reintroducing the ideas of, scientific method, observation, hypothesis, evidence, theory. And all of these will too be the driving forces behind the 19th century European discoveries in science in Europe. And scientists during the late 19th century Europe will start to argue that, you know what, yes, during the scientific revolution, indeed, we have been introduced to some breakthrough things, breakthrough discoveries in terms of, physics, math, astronomy, even chemistry. But very little, scientists in 19th century will argue, has been very little of these theories have actually been put in practical use. And it will be only with this new generation of scientists who will use all of these new observations to set up the foundations for some of these sciences that we still know and use very much today, including chemistry, biology, and advanced physics. So it's about finding a practical, real life applications of these scientific theories rather than just, making new theories, making new discoveries, and then publishing them posthumously because you are afraid that the church will get you, which was, as we studied in great deal, a problem during the scientific revolution. So here are some of the most notable examples of these scientists who lived and worked in late 19th century Europe. First of whom was this first among the New Age scientists will be a person called Louis Pasteur. We have a lot to thank to him today in the day and age when we sanitize our hands, when we sanitize our surfaces with Clorox and whatnot daily and hourly in each minute. So Louis Pasteur, he will be the one to discover amazing breakthroughs in understanding just how badly the polluted water that people were drinking was making people sick. And he was a French doctor, we would call him a microbiologist, and he will start the scientific inquiry. He will start his scientific career with asking a one simple question. He will say, well, what causes the wine to turn into a vinegar over time? Okay, so in fact, it was a known fact before the 19th century that if you leave wine to sit for a while, it actually will ferment even further and it will kind of turn into acid, right? But he will say, what is the cause of this chemical change? And he will discover that actually it is a process that how the wine turns into vinegar is carried by microscopic bacteria that we are unable to see with just our plain sight, right? And he will say, well, based on this, there are these teeny tiny particles called the microbes. And if microbes cause wine to turn into vinegar, then it may be that these microscopic organisms are also the causes of all of the diseases which we knew existed, but were unable to discover what causes the said diseases, right? And he was absolutely correct in making this assumption, which is why he will be credited with providing us the basis for the germ theory, right? So he will demonstrate that microscopic organisms, these teeny tiny particles that we cannot see, that he called germs, are actually the causes of the diseases, as well as the agents of contagion, meaning like transferring disease from one person to another by close contact or by sharing germs. We know today very much what this means when we talk about how to stop the spread of coronavirus as well. And he will be applying this theory first to the theory of germs and bacteria. And by 1870, the work of Louis Pasteur and others will kind of actually demonstrate that there is a significant correlation between the germs and the spread of the diseases. Also, if you are among those people who enjoy canning or who enjoy eating canned fruits and vegetables, and if you are doing that in the summer in order to preserve the freshness of the produce, you have used or have enjoyed the products of the process of pasteurization, which was named, obviously, after Louis Pasteur. And this came in 1880 when Pasteur will demonstrate that if you treat any matter with mild heat for a certain period of time and then hermetically seal it so that no air comes through in that, say, jar or a bottle, then this process will destroy or deactivate all of the bad organisms, all of the bad microbes or bad germs and bad enzymes that actually cause the food to spoil. And that's how we are able to preserve the freshness of, for instance, produce, fruits and veggies, right? So that's Louis Pasteur. And another two prominent scientists operating during this period, contributing to the development of modern science, are Robert Koch and Joseph Lister. Now, Robert Koch, he was a German physician and microbiologist, and he was the founding father of the new science called bacteriology, okay, which kind of will become a branch, like a smaller subsidiary branch of biology that studies nothing but bacteria, okay? And over the next 20 years, the researchers, mainly scientists from Germany, will identify organisms that were responsible, bacteria responsible for diseases of many different kinds. For example, in particular, Koch and his co-workers will discover the bacteria that causes the disease named tuberculosis, for which he also will win the Nobel Prize in 1905. And these discoveries, and many, many more discoveries like that, will lead to a development of a number of effective vaccinations. Even though some infections will resist the treatment until the scientists will develop antibiotics in the middle of the 20th century. But for the time being, just knowing the relation between germs and bacteria with certain diseases was a breakthrough discovery in the field of science. Then another prominent scientist named Joseph Lister will introduce to us, or will kind of take the germ theory introduced by Louis Pasteur a step further, particularly in the field of medicine. And he said, well, if Pasteur claims that, the air is full of these airborne harmful bacteria, then this might be the reason why all of the wounds that are kind of like exposed to the harmful air get infected in the first place. And he will reason that if we apply a chemical disinfectant to a wound dressing, then this will destroy all of the life and all of the harmful floating particles, aka germs, right? And he will do so by diluting the surgical dressing in acids and by diluting the surgical dressings in chlorine to prevent the stuff like disease, like the development of gangrene, right? When your body tissue gets infected because it hasn't been properly sterilized, or if your equipment hasn't been properly sterilized upon being cut, right? And so for that reason, we will give him the credit as the pioneer of the process of sterilization, right? So kind of cleaning the matter, cleaning your materials to eliminate the disease and infection causing bacteria. With Lister's discovery, surgeons and people in general will be starting to sterilize everything. So not just medical equipment and wounds, but also hands, clothing, working surfaces, to stop the spread the diseases, right? So these discoveries, the discoveries of bacteria and germs as agents of the spread of the diseases, and then also discovering tuberculosis bacteria and the method of sterilization will become very important, because they will help tremendously in reducing the death rates in Europe by late 19th century. So they decreased the number of deaths in Europe because now people knew how diseases, at least bacterial diseases, how they spread, and like things we can do to prevent that spread. Okay. Now, viruses were not discovered yet. We know viruses like coronavirus also are, destructive to human life. By that point in history, viruses were not discovered yet, and they won't be until the early 20th century. So for now, only bacteria was discovered as the cause of contagion, but even this was very dramatic improvement in people's understanding of how illnesses work and how illnesses are spread. Now, chemistry was another field that for the time being was kind of fairly and relatively new, and came as a consequence of the spread of the rapid scientific progress in the late 19th century. Chemists, for example, will come up with ways of measuring the atomic weight of various different chemical elements. And this will culminate with the Russian scientist named Dmitry Mendeleev, who in 1869 will come up with this very organized, very arranged table of elements. So if you ever walked into a chemistry class, I'm assuming you have, the first thing perhaps you have seen was the periodic table of elements displayed somewhere on a wall, and you kind of have to memorize what each combination of letters, what chemical element does the particular combination of letters represent, right? And so this originated, or was, I don't want to say invented, but discovered by the Russian scientist, the Russian chemist named Dmitry Mendeleev. And Mendeleev's periodic table was first published in 1869, and it had this kind of vertical chart type of organization with 63 different elements that were arranged by their atomic weight. And if I understand this correctly, the elements with the lightest atomic weight are the ones that are appearing first on the periodic chart. If someone has more experience with science than me, please shoot me an email and correct me. But that's how I understand a periodic table to work. Okay, and so this arrangement placed elements with, for instance, similar chemical properties into a horizontal rows. And the title, if you are wondering about Russian, what does this Cyrillic script tell us? The title from this original Mendeleev's work from Russian translates as draft of system of elements based on their atomic masses and chemical characteristics. Okay. Now, our discussion of modern science would absolutely not be complete without mentioning the genius of the English person called Charles Darwin, and his theories of human evolution. And so a bit about his background first. So Charles Darwin, he by vocation was what you would call a naturalist, or a person who studies natural history, studying, for instance, how old Earth is. But he also had some background, just like Isaac Newton, in theology, right? In fact, when Charles Darwin was in college in England, he studied and majored in religion. And he was only an amateur scientist, an amateur biologist and naturalist. However, upon finishing his theology schooling, he will sign up to join the Royal Navy of Great Britain, because he understood that if you join the Navy, you will travel to all these cool and different places across the world. And he was very interested in that endeavor. And this will take him to an exploration in different islands, first in South Pacific. But the ones that he was particularly interested in were the Galapagos Islands in the South Pacific. And he traveled there with the British Navy in 1830s. And then from there, he will also embark on the exploration of 5 different scientific cruises across the Latin America, together with the British Royal Navy. During these voyages, he will carefully collect and then study all different kinds of fossils and all different kinds of, specimens of different animal species. And in particular, he will study many of different birds living on the Galapagos Islands. And when he returns to England, he will, collect all of this fossil evidence. And he kind of was consulting also with some friends, geologists and biologists and naturalists in England as well. And he will came to doubt this general belief that all of these different species are the product of divine creation, or are the product of the God's work, right? So he So his task, the task of Charles Darwin, will be to attempt to dispute the theory that animals were indeed kind of created by God, essentially. And so, for example, by studying all of the bird fossils, he noticed that, say, some of them lived in a very harsh environments, and these harsh environments will require them to have or to develop stronger physical characteristics. For instance, stronger body, stronger wings, stronger beaks, that they had to develop if they wanted to survive in these harsh developments. Okay, so eventually he also borrowed from what we know as the Malthusian theory, right? Well, Malthus said that many more species, many more people are being born than are able to survive. And Charles Darwin will take this assumption and he will say this applies to animals too. And only few animals can survive things like food scarcity. In other words, he will kind of discover that some species of animals, will kind of adapt better to the environment than others. And those who fail to adopt, those who will fall ill to, say, malnutrition, they will kind of go extinct and they will just simply cease to exist. They will essentially die, right? And he published these findings in his first of major famous publications called On the Origin of Species in 1859. And in it, predominantly Darwin argued that most organisms produce more offspring than can survive, aka, thanks Malthus, we already know this because you said that, similar thing for humans, that it's in human nature to procreate, right? And so Charles Darwin will say the same thing about animals, and he will say, just like humans, if we start to if animals start to multiply uncontrollably, some of them will be able to adapt and the other ones will be driven into extinction due to the scarcity of resources, right? And Darwin claimed that those offspring that have the strongest characteristics will survive, while other weaker organisms will die, again, either due to diseases or it could be also predators, someone preying on you and, you not being able to survive, right? And this will be a process that people after him will proclaim to be called the survival of the fittest. Okay, so only the strongest organisms, those who are able to adapt to different and harsh environments, are more likely to survive this struggle for the survival of the fittest. So again, Darwin will not be the one to coin the term survival of the fittest, but studying his theories, scientists later will come to this conclusion about his theories. And so, where did these scientists in the future come to the conclusion that it is about the survival of the fittest? Well, they drew from this quote that's on your slide, that Darwin said, quote, "The vigorous, the healthy, and the happy survive and multiply." So they are the fittest, so they survive. And this is how, by the way, Darwin argued, this is how species evolve. This process of who lives and who dies is in essence a process of natural selection. Okay, it kind of occurs naturally. It's due to the law of nature. Okay. Then in the subsequent years, he will publish another one of his masterpieces titled The Descent of Men. Perhaps with this, he stirred up even greater controversy than with his first publication, because in it, he argued that humans are definitely not God's creations. They are not created on God's image, but rather humans descended from a closely related life forms or more specifically, a particular type of chimpanzee living who are known as the southern apes. Okay, so he was kind of suggesting that there is essentially nothing special or nothing divine about Homo sapiens, the wise men, us humans, right? So Homo sapiens are just, evolving. Homo sapiens are just a result of previous species who came before us, and we kind of evolved from them. And because we kind of evolved as the strongest, we evolved as the fittest to survive. This is kind of how we got there in the first place. Okay, so Darwin's controversial theory had a very powerful repercussions, very important consequences, because his ideas seem to have been suggesting that human evolution has occurred without God's interference, and that humans were simply just one species among many other millions of different kinds of species, just as the astronomers, just as the scientists in the scientific revolution of the 17th century concluded that, after, say, studying planets, planetary motions, and the universe, that the Earth is just one among the many of the planets, aka it's not the center of the universe. So that's what, Darwin had to say about biological evolution and how humans have evolved from earlier types of species into Homo sapiens. Now, when Darwin published his findings, when he published the theory of the survival of the fittest, he argued that this biological phenomena applies, that this discovery applies only to biological phenomena. What do I mean by this? I mean, that is to say that natural selection, the survival of the fittest, applies to how, for instance, plants, animals, and humans have evolved. But here is the problem, and here is where things get problematic, okay? Remember how during the Enlightenment and the first scientific revolution, there will be the scientists who will take these new scientific theories and turn them into something really wrong and problematic. Remember the race theory proposed by Linnaeus, and that all the race categories with all the nasty racial stereotypes attached to these racial groups, all racial groups except white. So we talked about how, the improvements, all of these great things about enlightenment, about scientific revolution, were kind of tarnished by a group of scientists who will, develop categories of race, and essentially created racism as a consequence of that. Well, a similar phenomena will occur with theories of Charles Darwin, because some people who, like Linnaeus, liked to fashion themselves as scientists, will take the Darwin's theory about the survival of the fittest, about evolution, and quite wrongly will twist it around yet again and make claims about white racial superiority. Are you even surprised by this point? And some people who prefer to call themselves social scientists will apply these biological concepts of natural selection and survival of the fittest, originally proposed by Charles Darwin, and they will try to apply it to the study of human behavior. So to the study of, let's say, sociology or politics, right? And this will be called social Darwinism. And social Darwinists like Herbert Spencer and William G. Sumner believed this. They believed that according to the theory of the survival of the fittest, certain people will become more powerful in the society because they are inherently, innately better. and only the best and the strongest have the potential to survive in this competitive world, right? And this idea regarding the survival of the fittest were applied to human survival by creating higher or fitter kinds of people versus the lower and the weaker races of humans. Okay, so essentially, social Darwinists will apply the struggle for the fittest of plants, of animals, which Darwin argued about, to the survival of human races. Okay, and so social Darwinist theories are theories about, as you will see in your primary source this week, that there are theories about this, that there's this brutal competition among different races of people to survive. Okay, and which one did you guess Europeans fashioned as the fittest to survive, right? In the eyes of the social Darwinists, it isn't only the white race, but it's actually a particular kind of white. So they are even the whitest among the white, according to social Darwinists. It's the Anglo-Saxons, it's the English, the Germans, the Scandinavians, right, who are the strongest and the widest among the white race. So definitely not people of African origin, definitely not people of Asian origin, definitely not Latinx people, definitely not even the Southern or Eastern Europeans, right? Why are whites the best, according to this theory? Well, social Darwinists argue that that's just the natural order of things. Whites are naturally dominant, and not only do the whites have the best physical strength, or best like physical agility, but also they have higher moral and intellectual standard than the lesser races. Again, this according to social Darwinists. So Northern European is therefore the most advanced, the most civilized, and the weaker races, meaning everybody else on the planet, becomes submissive, and therefore the, say, people of Southern European descent, of African and of Asian descent, are genetically, by nature, physically, morally, and intellectually inferior races, and they are submitting to the power of the strongest of the races, aka the Northern Europeans. You don't believe me? Here are the words of William G. Sumner. He says, quote, "We shall favor the survival of the unfittest, and we shall accomplish this by destroying liberty. Let it be understood that we cannot go outside of this alternative. Liberty, inequality, survival of the fittest, and not liberty, equality, and survival of the unfittest. The former carries society forward and favors all its best members. The latter carries society downwards and favors all its worst members." Okay? Now, this is what he had to say about what social Darwinism means, right? Kind of, he's defining that we should not be uplifting and supporting and seek equality with the unfit races, quote unquote. We should be championing the liberty only of the fittest, the liberty and equality only of the fittest of the people. Okay. By the way, William G. Sumner, he was a sociologist at Yale University, a very prominent institution. And if you claim you are a sociologist from Yale University, you better believe people will start to take your words as facts because you have credentials and because you have reputable institution backing you up. So this is very problematic, right? Speaking of people of influence, here are also the words of Karl Pearson. This is the excerpt from the primary source you are reading this week also, in which he explains what social Darwinism means to him. He was mathematician and bioscientist and professor at the University College London. He says, quote, this: "History shows me one way and one way only in which a high state of civilization has been produced, namely the struggle of race with race, in the survival of the physical and mentally fitter race. If you want to know whether the lower races of man can evolve a higher type, I fear the only course is to leave them to fight it out among themselves, and even then the struggle for the existence between the individual and individual, between the tribe and tribe, may not be supported by that physical selection due to a practical climate on which probably so much of the Aryan success depended. You may hope for a time when a sword shall be turned into the plowshare, when American and German and English traders shall no longer compete in the markets of the world for their raw material and for their food supply, when the white man and the dark shall share the soil between them, and each till it as he lists. But, believe me, when the day comes, mankind will no longer progress. There will be nothing to check the fertility of the inferior stock." This is hard to read. "The relentless law of heredity will not be controlled and guided by natural selection. Men will stagnate, and unless he ceases to multiply, the catastrophe will come again." Essentially, I don't think I have to interpret this for you. His words are pretty straightforward. The theory of the alleged natural superiority and inferiority among races will kind of become popular among people, and the words, like according to his words, he sees that the existence of humans is essentially the struggle between different races, right? And he will also say that, very much like Sumner before him, that if we are encouraging the cooperation between different races of people, that this is where the progress of humankind will stop, right? And in fact, if anything, we need to find ways to limit the procreation of the inferior stock, so that way we can ensure progress of just the fittest race, okay? So all of these social Darwinist theories about one race being stronger, about one race being better, more moral, more intelligent than others, will inspire indeed a new wave of European colonization of the world, mostly continent of Africa and Asia, in the so-called new imperialism of the late 19th century. Okay, so all of these new theories about, social Darwinism, created by Spencer Graham and Karl Pearson, will come to Europe and America right on time for new imperialism. Why do I say right on time? Because Europeans will now have a reason, if not an excuse, a scientific theory by renowned scientists of the time, according to which, and they believe to be true, that now whites have the right to colonize what whites at the time called to be, quote unquote, the lesser races. So, what is new imperialism? Well, it's this late 19th century drive, mainly by European powers and later also by America, to expand the colonization of the entire world. And countries who will participate in the new imperialism will include the usual suspects, including Great Britain, France, Italy, and Portugal, but also smaller states like, say, Belgium. Okay? And if you want to talk about the scale of the new imperialism, we can say that by early 20th century, meaning by early 1900s, almost 84% of the globe, of the entire world, was dominated in some way, shape, or form by the European and American nations, right? And the consequence of the new imperialism will be putting millions and millions of non-white peoples directly under the European rule. For example, if you were to look at just a map of the continent of Africa, prior to 1880s, prior to the new imperialism, Europeans controlled only about 10% of the continent. So this is the map you see on the left. Okay, so we see the power of the indigenous societies, indigenous to the continent of Africa, springing on the edges of the continent. But we also see the British, who by this point were dominating the tip of South Africa. We also see the Turkish, or the so-called Ottoman Empire, dominating at this point the territories in North Africa as well. And we also see French, who we already know came in to conquer the territory of Algeria, as well as the territory of what today is known as the country of Senegal in the western portions of African continent, right? But after 1880s, things will start to change drastically for the African continent, because there will be the so-called event called the Scramble or Partition of Africa. And Partition of Africa was the event in which almost all of the major European powers, including Britain, including France, including Belgium, Germany, Italy, will between 1880 and 1814 literally meet to section, to redraw the map, to redraw the borders of the African countries or African kingdoms, and they turned them into European occupied colonies, inspired by the idea of social Darwinism, arguing that it is Europeans' responsibility to come and conquer quote-unquote uncivilized peoples. And by 1900s, nearly the entire continent of Africa has been carved up and under a place of European rule, with two noticeable exceptions. One being the Ethiopia, which will fight it off with the Italian invaders, and also the territory of Libya, which will be settled by freed enslaved persons from the United States. So with these two exceptions, the entire continent came under the European control. And each mother colony, each of these European powers, will have, for instance, government representatives, and they will rule over the political, social, economic, and cultural life of their own established colony. So let's look at one of the examples, okay? One of the most atrocious stories in history, or also in the history of Africa, was that of Belgian colonization of the country that today is known as the Democratic Republic of Congo in Central Africa. The Kingdom of Belgium was, and Republic of Belgium today still is, like teeny tiny, very small territorially. It's about the size of West Virginia, if not smaller. Yet, all it takes is for just one individual with very imperialistic visions and a very greedy personality to make his kingdom almost 70 times larger than the original size of the Belgian kingdom, right? And his name, this atrocious person's name, was King Leopold II. Now, what was King Leopold II doing in Congo in the first place? Well, just like any story of colonization, this too was first incentivized by a desire for profit. Because since 1870s, Leopold's expansion will focus predominantly on territory of Central Africa, And Congo was seized by Belgium in 1876. And Congo at the time was attractive to Belgians because the country was rich in ivory. It was rich and also in rubber. It was kind of rich in all of these high trees present in Congo's tropical rainforests, which were full of this raw material called rubber. And one of the reasons why Congo rubber business was so profitable for Leopold was because to harvest the rubber in the wild requires no cultivation. It requires no fertilizers. It requires no capital investment in any sort of equipment or anything. You just literally send your people there, make people work for you, and you reap the benefits of the entire thing, right? So it was kind of already there available for you. It was available in the nature, and it only required human labor. The rubber trees are approximately 100 feet tall, and workers would have to kind of climb all the way high to slash the vines of rubber with the knife. So working conditions for people whom Leopold will treat as enslaved workers was very terrible because climbing the rubber trees was extremely dangerous business. It was extremely painful because the vines of the trees are quite sharp. It had like really sharp edges. And now you might be asking, well, how in the world did forces of Leopold convince the Congolese men and women to work for them? Well, the representatives of the Belgian government will collect Congolese men to work by first coming in and kidnapping their wives and kidnapping their children from their villages, and they will threaten to rape or kill women and children if they don't come and perform work for Leopold, okay? And the Congolese workers were pushed to limits of exhaustion to collect their very harsh daily mandatory quotas. And what happens if the worker doesn't meet the quota? Then I will show you what happens on the next slide, but not before I preface that the images I'm about to show you are quite disturbing. Okay, so before I click on the next slide, I would like to issue a trigger warning for violent content. And if you wish, you can look away for the part of this slide if you would feel that this would trigger you. Okay, so here I am. If you don't meet the daily quota, then there were two main forms of punishment. One of which was the whipping, and the other one was having your hands or feet cut off. All right, very horrible instruments of torture and labor torture in particular. And Leopold's reign of Congo was rightfully called one of the worst man-made humanitarian disasters in the 20th century because I would argue this was a genocide of sorts, justified by claims of social Darwinism, claiming that, black bodies do not fit the criteria for the survival of the fittest, and for that reason, they don't matter that much. So let's exploit them instead. So, due to the brutality of Belgians, images of which are currently on the slide, there were approximately 15 million of Congolese men, women, and children who will lose their lives during the Belgian occupation of Congo. 15 million people is the size of approximately city of Los Angeles. That's a lot of people. They completely vanished, all right? And I know these images are disturbing, but I think that history is more than just a collection of fun facts about Napoleon or fun facts about American presidents. And in order to really understand the lessons of history, in order to really understand the root of this idea that all lives are not valuable, we have to sometimes get uncomfortable in studying that kind of history, right? Now, Leopold was actually one of the first Europeans to send expeditions to see what kinds of natural resources, what kinds of natural materials Europeans can extract from the continent. And because they will say, wait, if country as small as Belgium, this teeny tiny country in North Europe, if they can conquer a country the size of Congo, then imagine what us, say, British, German, Italian, can do in America. So the rest of the countries in Europe will see the British experience in Congo as encouraging to go ahead and conquer the rest of the continent. And so this scramble for the rest of the continent, this race for the territory, will begin. And so, to lay down some basic rules for this new and very dangerous competition, European nations will organize a formal conference in Berlin, the Berlin Conference of 1844. And this will be the meeting that will put in motion the official partition or scramble for Africa. And at the conference, the attendees would establish these principles, or they will establish some basic rules on how European countries should compete for territories in Africa. And they will establish this rule that if any European country wants to claim a colony in Africa for themselves, then it will be based in the principle of the so-called effective occupation, meaning that there would have to be a strong European presence on the ground if a certain country was to claim that territory. So if you want other countries in Europe to accept that you formally are owning this territory, then you literally need like European boots on the ground. And you kind of need representatives from that European country to be physically present in the African territory that you are claiming as yours. The Berlin Conference also goes by the name African Conference of 1844, but you guessed it, there were no representatives from Africa present at that meeting in Berlin. It was literally just a bunch of white guys looking at the map of Africa and literally drawing the lines of conquest as they saw fit at the moment. So, division of Africa, the partition of Africa, was the most dramatic, most spectacular for Europeans. But also worth noting is that another part of new imperialism, Europeans will also start to look to claim political control in the territories of Asia. For example, where are you? The teeny tiny country of Netherlands, it's purple. The teeny tiny country of Netherlands in Europe will colonize, literally take over the present day territory of Indonesia, and British will conquer the territory of India since 1750 onward. Also, French will claim territory in today's countries of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. If you look at the orange parts of the map, right? And in fact, when I point to you at this part of the world, you should be familiar with this part of the world because French colonization of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia will create the circumstances for the development of Vietnam War later in the history, right? And part of this new imperialism, it's important to note, was also countries like United States claiming their territories in Pacific as well. And as you see on this map, United States will start to claim that the Philippines, the Philippine Islands, are now in colonial possession of the United States. And they will also colonize the islands of Guam, Samoa, and Hawaii. You don't see this on a map, but they are in the deeper Pacific Ocean between, of course, United States, Australia, and Asia. Now, let's chat before we finish about let's dive deeper into the causes of the new imperialism. We've said that social Darwinism was the strongest incentive, the strongest cause, the strongest factor of new imperialism for sure. Again, the European nations were seeing themselves as racially distinct, and as racially dominant, as being white. And for that reason, they have the right to seize the colonies to show exactly how powerful, how the fittest they indeed are, right? And also, they claimed that since the survival of the fittest is indeed the law of the nature, then the conquest of the quote unquote inferior peoples was justified and actually even moral and actually necessary, right? And so, social Darwinism and this pseudoscientific racial doctrines will foster the imperialist expansion. But as we've seen with the example of Leopold II of Belgium, this will also be true of the rest of the colonizers as well. There was this desire for profit among the European nations, this desire to get wealthier. So colonization provided almost sort of a rise of economic competition among European states for, who can accumulate more wealth, okay? And the truth, however, is that the imperial possessions, maybe Adam Smith was right almost a century ago, the colonial possessions cost you money, right? They did not pay off economically for the country, the colonizer country, right? And only the wealthy few, the traders, the merchants, the elite classes, and businessmen will actually see the profit from the colonies. And so they profited at the expense of both European taxpayers and even, of course, greater expense of the people whom they colonized, of the native people of these territories. So colonies were actually not economically feasible. It will cost the empire too much money when you have to rule over them politically. And overall, they will not bring too much wealth to the colonizing country indeed. But Western societies did not rest the case for the empire and colonies on just naked political conquest and Darwinian social/racial struggle. Because perhaps the most often excuse that they used will be, and like the most publicly known excuse that they used, will be that they are actually, the white people of Europe are actually called in by this divine intervention inside of them to go and spread the Western civilization onto other uncivilized peoples, right? They will see that the territory of Africa and Asia was ideal because people in these territories are quote unquote primitive, and they are not practicing the right kind of civilization, right? So the idea here is that if you are anything but white, then if you do not practice Western culture, meaning, here's what this means, this is important, meaning if you're not Christian, if you don't wear Western clothing, if you don't read Western books, if you are not speaking English, if you are not practicing Western forms of government, aka democracy and parliaments and such, then you must be shown how to do those things, because in the eyes of white Europeans and Americans, these are the best and most desirable forms to guide societies. Okay, so there will be this idea that the Westerners have the responsibility to teach the non-white civilizations on how to do those things, right? And Europeans, and certainly Americans in the Philippines and in the Pacific Islands, will saw this as a civilizing mission, and they believe it was their duty and responsibility. And so, to kind of go along with that, maybe you've heard about the poem called The White Man's Burden, written by Rudyard Kipling. And you will actually, if you haven't, you will read this as your primary source for this week. But essentially, Kipling was a British writer, a poet, who will write a poem supporting the theory behind the white man's burden of providing the non-whites with all of these modern achievements and higher standards of living, right? And the point was that it will be good for the nations whom Europeans and Americans are colonizing, and that, you know, the whites carry this burden that they have to like teach people. They have to like teach quote unquote savages on the about the appropriate ways of how to live, how to pray, or who to pray to, or what kind of government to have, how to live, how to breathe, and to make their lives supposedly better. Now, supposedly better, let's focus on that for a second, because did the standards of living really improve in these places once Europeans came to colonize them, right? We can argue absolutely not. And at the very least, we could argue that perhaps things like missionary schools that Europeans will establish across Asia and Africa will indeed increase the spread of literacy. And if you want to talk about the benefits, we can have an argument that perhaps there were some infrastructural gains that will occur as colonizers did build roads, for instance, and did build hospitals in certain places. But overall, generally, there was no overwhelming improvement in the living standards for the native residents at all. But even the building of, when you just look at education, right? Even the building of schools, it's also about not what you did, but how you did it and what kind of values did you teach in those schools, right? Pictured on the slide is one of the schools that Germans will build in what they called the German East Africa. And here you see a person, a teacher, who is teaching in the classroom that has on the artwork on a wall, and we see portraits of the German Emperor Wilhelm I and his wife, kind of looking down on the students with intimidation in the classroom as this constant reminder of political control, right? And in schools like this, Europeans will argue that they are spreading the benefits of what they thought to be a superior civilization. But in these schools, African children were taught Western values. There was no space for cherishing the cultures, the religions, the forms of government of the native people, the traditions that they loved and cherished for centuries, right? And another part of that civilizing mission and part of that burden was the spread of Christianity, because Protestant and Catholic missionaries alike, both men and women, will be seeking converts and will be building schools like this one to actually spread the gospel, to kind of, because Christians thought that they are teaching them the correct religion, that religions they were practicing, traditional African religions, which are many and which are, diverse, that these kinds of religions are not correct, right? And that at long last, they thought that even though the native peoples already had their own religion, belief systems, that the native and ancient and all of these very complex and interesting religious beliefs are not worthy, and that Christianity is better and needs to replace all of these native religious forms. Okay? So we can conclude that during the age of new imperialism in the late 19th century, the countries in Europe partitioned amongst themselves what they considered, quote, underdeveloped parts of the world. And this was kind of fueled by the deeply racist theories of social Darwinism, Important to note here, if you haven't picked up on this already, Darwin did not, when he wrote his theories, could not have foreseen that his theories would have taken such a racist turn in the eyes of Sumner and in the eyes of Lugard and in the eyes of other people you will read for primary source this week, right? And interestingly, critics of the European imperialism, majority of whom were actually Marxist and communist in their ideology, they will accuse white Europeans with applying a like a double standard and failing to live up to their own noble ideas, right? Because Marxists will say, at home in Europe, at home in Germany, Great Britain, wherever, you are winning all of these goals of liberty and democracy. You're claiming you're expanding the universal suffrage, the universal right to vote. You have so much improvements in Europe. You are winning the representative government. You are claiming you're supporting individual liberties, equality of opportunity, right? But in their empires, Marxists will argue, Europeans are imposing, and installing military dictatorships where colonial administrators will kind of force Africans and Asians to work involuntarily, like we've seen with the example of Leopold II of Belgium, almost like slaves, and subjected them to the shameless discrimination, just like Leopold II of Belgium, right? And one of them, the Russian Marxist, the Russian communist, and future revolutionary named Vladimir Lenin, he will conclude that imperialism only proves that capitalist system doesn't work, that it's flawed, and that it needs to be eradicated, right? And we will talk more about Lenin when the time comes and the communist revolution in Russia. But this is me getting ahead and just providing you an insight of the fact that not everybody perhaps in Europe was on board with this idea, and that critics of the new imperialism mainly came from the ranks of the left, or the ranks of, at the time, socialists, as well as more predominantly Marxist communists. Okay, this was a long lecture. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again next week. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.